a whiteboard video. So today we're going to talk about the Aberfan disaster. Now, if you don't know, the Aberfan disaster was a disaster on October 25th, 1966 in Aberfan, Wales in the United Kingdom, in which a spoil tip from a coal mining essentially caused a landslide that slid down the side of a hill and hit the town of Aberfan, primarily a couple houses and then a junior school that had 240 kids ages 8 to 13 in it, and ended up killing 116 children and 28 adults for a total of 144 people. Now, it was covered in the Netflix show The Crown, but it wasn't ever really explained exactly what happened. So to start out with, you need to know what a spoil tip is. So Aberfan is very famous for its coal mining. And when you do coal mining, you have a lot of excess waste that you have to deal with because coal is obviously underground. So you have to dig down underground and then make that hole, and then you have to deal with the remains of that hole and get rid of it. And then when you actually get to the coal, you have to get the coal out and then separate the coal away from the rest of the surrounding rock. So then you have to get rid of that rock, and then you have to continue digging down deeper, and so on and so on and so on. So one of the solutions that mining companies have come up with is to create what is called a spoil tip. Essentially, it is a mound of rock. Blown up rock, taken apart rock, things like that. And what they do is they take the stuff that they pull out of the ground. Here, we'll draw the ground here so that it makes more sense. Flat ground. They take the rock and they put essentially a conveyor belt on the edge of it. And as they blow up more rock, they take the rock, they put it on the conveyor belt, and they drop it on top of the spoil tip, and it falls down the edge and it makes it bigger. And eventually, as it gets taller and taller, as they move their conveyor belt up, and it makes a giant pile like so, all the way up until it gets to be a point where they're like, hey, this may end up being unstable, we should do it again somewhere else. So then they move it and they make another one. In Aberfan, they had done so much mining that they were on their 7th spoil tip. That was spoil tip number 7. And the vast majority of it was blown up rock, but at least a portion of it was essentially coal slurry, the leftover remains of stuff that they couldn't get away from the coal and things like that. So we move forward here. In order to understand the Aberfan disaster, you have to understand where this town of Aberfan sits. So, it is in the bottom of a valley that has been carved by the River Taff. So it kind of looks like this. So you have your valley, it goes down like this, and then like that. And you have your river right here. This is River Taff right here. You have your hill. Now, your height, your altitude right down in this area is about 487 feet. We're just going to round it to 490 feet. Is your altitude right down here next to the river. This altitude right here is about 1,000 feet or so. Now, if you're thinking to yourself, if they're mining in this hill and they're mining for coal, where are they putting their spoil tips? Surely they wouldn't put it on top of the giant hill that sits directly over the town that exists down here. Here, we'll draw a little house right here. And I'm not kidding, the house, this town literally sits right on the river, right at the bottom of the hill. Surely they wouldn't put their spoil tip right on top of the hill that sits directly next to a town full of people and children. And you, dear listener, would be incorrect because they had run out of space on the hill, so they started to put them on the edge of the hill. So they put spoil tip number 7 right here. I'm not exaggerating. Right at the top of the hill, right on the edge of it. And this spoil tip in particular was about, at the time of the collapse, about 111 feet tall in height. Had been built up and was about 111 feet tall. Now, on the night of October 20th, 1966, into the morning of October 21st, 1966. At some point during the night, the top of this spoil tip had collapsed down and caved in like this and created a giant hole. It had created a hole big enough that their rail that they used to carry more material up to the top of the spoil tip had also fallen inside of it. And when they showed up for work, they being the coal company, showed up for work at about 7:30 in the morning on October 21st, they realized that they had a shift in the spoil tip. And they called their supervisor, and the supervisor said, okay, we're not doing anything today, shut it down. We'll figure out where we're gonna put a new spoil tip next week. So they did. Fast forward about an hour and 45 minutes later, about 9:15 a.m., and all of a sudden there was a large shift in the bottom of this right here as it began to move downhill. So the reason this started to fail is in the 3 weeks leading up to the actual disaster itself, it had rained about 6.5 inches in the area of Aberfan. In total, the week prior, it had been the vast majority, about 4 inches in the week prior, from about the 14th of October till the 21st of October. It had rained about 4 inches in this area. But in addition to that, so all of that rainwater had fallen into this area, had soaked into this pile. Because remember, this is just a pile of loose debris that they have pulled out of the ground. There's no packing. It literally just gets pulled up and dropped on top. It's essentially a giant sand pile. So in addition to the 6.5 inches of rain that has fallen down here and has soaked into this giant mountain of debris, they also built this particular spoil tip directly on top of several springs that welled water up out of the ground here. Which means that as groundwater comes up and as these springs are filled with water that are falling from the sky, it is going up into the bottom of this and making this even more unstable. So at around 9:15, when there was a massive shift in this, the vibration of that liquefied the entire bottom portion of this spoil tip and essentially turned it into a giant liquid. So what that means is essentially there was so much water, it was so saturated that when that movement vibrated, it liquefied all of that material, not literally, but more or less liquefied it, suspended all of those pieces of rock inside of the saturation of the water that was inside the bottom of this coal tip, and began sliding down the hill towards Aberfan. Now, as soon as it gets down the hill, it starts going down the hill. It's a wave about 30 feet high, a giant black wave, because it's all coal, right? So everything that comes out of a coal mine ends up black and covered in coal dust. So this giant wall of water is entirely black as it comes rushing down the hill. It's a 30-foot wall of water moving about 20-ish, 10 to 20 miles per hour down this hill. Right about here, I'm going to put this one in purple. Right about here, there is a railroad track. Just before it are a couple more houses. It smashes into these houses instantly, destroys these houses completely, kills the families that are inside of them, and then it hits this railroad track. Now, usually, in theory, this railroad track would have stopped at least some of this as it was coming down the hill. The unfortunate problem is that as it came down the hill, it broke two water mains that added more water to the already incredibly liquid material that's moving down as about 140,000 square yards of material that started rushing down this hill. As it hit the railroad, it splashed over and continued on with the extra water it gained from those two water mains and ended up smashing into the Pant Glass Junior School, which had 240 students in it at the time. That's more or less where the flood stopped. The problem is that once this stops moving, it's no longer liquid. It almost instantly turns back into solid material, and it becomes, instead of having like a flood where you might have the chance to float to the surface in an actual flood, it becomes solid material again, and everyone has to be dug out. So it filled the Pant Glass Junior School with about 30 feet of material with the 240 students in it that they had to hand dig out because it was no longer liquid. Now, if you're wondering if anyone was ever punished for putting a giant unstable mass on the top of a hill that could, kill 144 people at the town below it, the answer is no. The National Coal Board, which was found to be most liable for the disaster, received no punishment whatsoever. No fine, no one was arrested, no one was fired, no one was even demoted. In fact, some people were promoted afterwards. In addition, the town of Aberfan put together a donation where they would collect, pounds for people to send in to give to the victims of the disaster. One of the boards that oversaw it originally determined that the people that lost children and family members in the disaster should not receive a payment that would violate the terms of the fund. That was argued by lawyers that it made no sense, so then they were graciously given £50 if they lost someone in the disaster. They argued that that was also not enough, so they increased it to £500, which is, still not enough. But that £500 was only given to parents who lost children if they were interviewed and they were deemed sufficiently close enough to their children to be actually suffering mental anguish from the loss of their child. Additionally, the National Coal Board graciously offered to give parents who lost their children £50, and parents said, hey, that's not enough, so they increased it to £500, and still parents said, hey, that's not enough compensation for your decisions leading to the death of my child at school on their last day of school before holiday, because that makes this somehow way worse. And the National Coal Board replied, the parents who were trying to get more money were just taking advantage of the situation. Because, of course they did. In addition, there were 6 other coal tips on top of this hill, one of which was dangerously close to collapsing at the time spoil tip number 7 collapsed, and the National Coal Board said that they would not pay to remove them. Then the UK government said, we won't pay to remove them. So the disaster fund for Aberfan eventually was like, hey, we'll pay for it. And so the National Coal Board was like, oh, well, if they're going to pitch in £250,000, then we'll pitch in some money. And then the government was like, okay, if they're going to do it, then we'll pitch in some money, but we won't pay more than £1 million. So Aberfan's disaster fund ended up paying £150,000 to have the spoil tips removed, and the National Coal Board ended up paying 300 and something thousand. It ended up being a grand total of £850,000 to have the spoil tips removed. But it took the disasters taking a bunch of coal slurry and taking it to their MP's office and dumping it on his desk to convince him, hey, this is a problem and we need to deal with it. So it took a long time, but eventually they were removed. And I know this sounds and looks ridiculous, because who in their right mind puts this on the edge of a hill? But it 100%, this is exactly what they did. And they didn't think anything of it. No one was like, hey, maybe we shouldn't put this here. Maybe this giant unstable thing will slide down the hill and kill people. But instead they continued to, and this is what we ended up with.